You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 319, France Struggles Toward Peace. Last week, we left off with the struggles of both the British and American delegations to form a coherent negotiation strategy for the peace treaty. The British Prime Minister, the Earl of Shelburne, seemed to change his views on American independence with each conversation. Benjamin Franklin, who had been the American representative in France for several years, was dealing with recall efforts headed by Arthur Lee in the Continental Congress. Franklin also had to figure out a way to work with his fellow peace commissioners. Now, sometime during the summer of 1782, Franklin suffered a bout of bladder stones, which made traveling or even just moving very painful. Franklin had to remain in bed, and John Jay took over the primary negotiation role for the Americans. Franklin, of course, had been serving in France for many years by this time, and he was well ensconced in elite French society. This gave him many advantages in negotiating with France. He had negotiated the 1778 Treaty of Alliance with France, which required that America would not reach peace terms with Britain until France also agreed to a peace. Franklin firmly believed that American success was tied to the French alliance. By contrast, Franklin's fellow commissioner, John Jay, had spent very little time in France, spoke no French, and was much less interested in maintaining a relationship with America's ally than negotiating a peace treaty with Britain. Jay had spent 2 years as minister to Spain and got nothing but a cold shoulder from the government in Madrid. As a result, he had no attachment to Spanish interests either. At one point, Jay suggested to the British negotiator, Richard Oswald, that Britain should redeploy its armies in New York and Charleston to recapture West Florida from Spain. Jay told the British negotiator that he would rather have Britain as a neighbor than Spain. Clearly, Jay had no intention of simply following the lead of either France or Spain in any negotiation. While Jay was aware of the instructions from Congress to follow France's lead in negotiations, he was also aware that delegates in Congress, led by Arthur Lee, were pulling away from that idea and that many now distrusted France to have America's best interests at heart when negotiating this final peace. In addition to negotiating with Richard Oswald, Jay began using Franklin's British back-channel contact, Richard Vaughan, to establish direct communications with the Earl of Shelburne in London. The ministry in Britain saw Jay as an opportunity to separate America from France and Spain in these negotiations. British agents showed Jay a letter from the Secretary of French Minister Luzerne in Philadelphia. This letter argued against allowing Americans to get the western lands all the way to the Mississippi River. These British agents also informed him that the French minister Vergennes had sent Alexander Gerard de Reyneval to Britain. Gerard de Reyneval had been the first French ambassador in America. He had returned to France back in 1779 and was working with the foreign ministry. During the summer of 1782, Gerard de Reyneval had traveled in secret to open direct peace negotiations between France and Britain. This British-provided intelligence convinced Jay that France and Spain were conspiring to bargain away any western lands in America in exchange for other British concessions to them. As Britain had hoped, Jay began pressing forward negotiating directly with Britain, cutting France and Spain out entirely. Jay's reports back to America also gave Arthur Lee more ammunition to press forward with his own desired plan to break with France. Back in the summer of 1781, before Yorktown, and when things were looking pretty bleak for the Americans, Congress had instructed its peace commissioners to follow France's lead in any peace negotiations. A year later, in the summer of 1782, Lee proposed that Congress form a commission to reconsider the instructions to the commissioners. He intended to give them the authority to negotiate a separate peace with Britain without any coordination with France or Spain. Like Jay, Lee believed that France could not be trusted with American interests in any final negotiations. Of course, even after Yorktown, America was still heavily dependent on the French alliance. The Continental Congress had only survived financially for the past several years from gifts or loans from Europe. Future gifts or loans looked difficult, especially if they were going to go against the diplomatic interests of those European powers. Others in Congress recognized this reality and pushed back against Lee's efforts to break the Treaty of Alliance with France and seek a separate peace with Britain. Leading the opposition to Lee's proposals was a young delegate, also from Virginia. Since his arrival in Philadelphia 2 years earlier, James Madison had been focused on the ongoing financial crisis that Congress had failed to fix. He opposed any moves that would cause a break in the Franco-American alliance at this critical time, especially when Congress was still asking Franklin to arrange additional loans from France to keep the Continental government operational. To address Lee's concerns, Madison proposed a committee to review Congress's instructions to the delegates, but then he ensured that he and 4 other delegates who strongly supported the French alliance be nominated to that committee. He froze out Lee from having any say on the changes, and Congress overwhelmingly supported the Madison Committee plan and left Lee and his allies powerless. In frustration, Lee wrote a letter to a friend in Virginia that expressed his hostility toward France. When this letter became public, it threatened to create a rift between the two countries. The Virginia Assembly considered a motion of censorship in recalling Lee from the Continental Congress. Lee appeared to want to destroy America's alliance with France. The vast majority of American leaders realized this would be a fatal error. In the end, Lee's important family connections in Virginia resulted in the censure vote failing, narrowly, but the American debate over whether to break with France in pursuing peace with Britain remained highly contentious on both sides of the Atlantic. Back in France, Foreign Minister Vergennes was keeping a close eye on the Americans. His minister in Philadelphia, Luzerne, kept him up to date on the debates in Congress and Lee's efforts to break with France. France was certainly motivated to bring the war to an end. They were going deeply into debt and were finding it increasingly difficult to borrow money to continue the war. If finances were going to decide who won this protracted war, Britain had the clear advantage. In addition, France needed to end the war soon, or it might find itself ousted as a key power in Europe. Around this time, Crimea was an independent power that was essentially controlled by Russia. In June of 1782, a group backed by the Ottoman Empire overthrew the Russian-backed government in Crimea. Russia responded by blocking all the ports and massing 15,000 soldiers on the Crimean border. Russia also allied with Austria. Joseph II of Austria saw an opportunity to ally with Russia so that both powers could take more control of the Ottoman territories. Although France was busy with these other wars, Austria and Russia offered France the prize of Egypt if France would support the invasion of Crimea. France, though, was allied with the Ottomans. It had a valuable trade relationship with them. Vergennes, who had been the French ambassador in Constantinople for many years, realized that what was going on was a power play by Russia and Austria to extend their power, which would be to France's disadvantage. Vergennes also knew that he was in this position because of France's ongoing war with Britain. France had traditionally allied itself with Austria. After all, Queen Marie Antoinette's marriage to King Louis was supposed to embody that alliance. But if France and Austria found themselves as enemies, France would be particularly isolated and would be vulnerable, especially if it continued to weaken itself through this ongoing war with Britain. Now, part of ending the war required that France had to worry about its treaty with Spain. Remember that Spain had entered the war back in 1779, and France had agreed that the war would not end until Spain recovered Gibraltar. Years of siege had led to nothing. British defenses there were far too strong, and the British Navy seemed capable of resupplying the garrison whenever it was needed. Vergennes agreed to an all-out effort with Spain to take Gibraltar in the fall of 1782. A combined French and Spanish fleet would be supplemented by the construction of 10 floating batteries that would be towed into place to rain down artillery fire on Gibraltar. The batteries had walls built with 3-foot wide oak timbers packed with wet sand in between to prevent direct fire. and had decks also covered with wet sand in order to prevent hot shot from setting them on fire. Each battery held between 10 and 26 large siege guns to pound the enemy defenses. Over 4,000 men would serve on these batteries alone. The combined French and Spanish fleet also included 47 ships of the line with a total of 40,000 soldiers and sailors against the garrison of about 7,000 British and Hessian soldiers in Gibraltar. The Duc de Crillon took command of this force in March of 1782. At that point, he had recently defeated the British at Minorca and was considered one of France's best military commanders. France and Spain spent most of the summer preparing their armies and navies for this definitive assault. On the night of September 13, 1782, the fleets towed their floating batteries into place. At around 7 in the morning, they opened fire. A floating line of artillery stretched over 2/3 of a mile, throwing everything they could at the British lines. The artillery fire continued back and forth all day. During the morning, the British grew frustrated that they could not penetrate these thick walls on the firing platforms. Over time, they switched to hot shot, which is just really highly heated cannonballs, in an effort to burn these floating platforms. At first, the efforts to contain the fire damage seemed to work, but eventually enough British hotshots hit wood of the floating batteries and set them aflame. By nightfall, the shooting from the floating batteries had stopped as the crew tried to escape the burning vessels. Overnight, most of the batteries exploded as flames reached the ammunition bunkers. By morning, the 2 remaining batteries were set on fire by their own crews in order to prevent their capture by the enemy. The remainder of the fleet, however, continued the siege. Although they had not been able to crush the British garrison militarily, the defenders on Gibraltar had used much of their ammunition to defeat those platforms and were at risk of running out of just about everything. The siege continued for several more weeks until a British relief fleet under Admiral Richard Howe arrived on October 11th. Howe led a fleet of 38 ships in the line, escorting close to 150 merchant supply ships, carrying everything that the garrison needed. Howe's fleet was outgunned by the 49 ships of the line in the French and Spanish fleets. Howe placed his warships between the enemy and the merchant fleet. The French and Spanish fleets seemed reluctant to engage. Some people blame this on the terrible losses they had recently taken in the West Indies, but in any event, their failure to engage allowed the merchant fleet to sail into Gibraltar and supply the garrison with everything it would need for the next year. The British Navy had once again broken the siege. For the French leadership, the impending war in Eastern Europe and the failure of the siege of Gibraltar, along with the accumulating war debt, made France especially eager to find a path to peace. Unfortunately, the American peace delegation only seemed to create more complications. In October of 1782, shortly after the British success at Gibraltar, John Adams arrived in France from the Netherlands. Adams was feeling especially cocky, having just concluded a Dutch loan of 5 million guilders for the Continental Congress. At the time of his arrival, Adams already disliked Franklin. The 2 men decidedly did not get along when Adams had been in France a few years earlier. Adams also had concerns about Jay, since he thought Jay was too closely associated with the infamous Silas Deane. Adams spent the first 3 days in Paris, getting a new suit tailored, finding suitable quarters, and chatting with old friends. He refused to call on Franklin. This was seen as a public sign of disrespect. Finally, after some persuasion by his friends, Adams rode out to Passy and met with Franklin. At that meeting, Adams told Franklin that he thought Jay was doing a good job with the negotiations and that Adams intended to support Jay's efforts and ignore the French. Franklin mostly listened and didn't really respond. A few days later, Franklin did mention to Adams that Vergennes was offended that Franklin had not even bothered to call on the French ministry, something every foreign diplomat was expected to do. A contrite Adams scheduled a visit. When he got there, Vergennes tried to use his diplomatic charm with Adams, treating him to a lavish dinner and congratulating him on arranging the Dutch loan. Adams was polite, but unmoved. Shortly after the meeting with Vergennes, Adams also called on the British negotiator, Richard Oswald, to assure him that Adams and Jay wanted to continue direct negotiations and were not concerned about coordinating their efforts with France. Franklin found himself in the difficult position of either breaking with his fellow peace negotiators from America and standing with France as America's ally, or joining Adams and Jay to negotiate a separate peace and creating a potential break with France. In the end, Franklin decided that keeping unanimity among the U.S. commissioners was the most important thing and agreed to cooperate with the negotiations that Jay had been conducting with Oswald. Now, for Vergennes, holding a grudge against American defection was not going to solve anything. Vergennes, above all, was a realist. France was going broke, it was losing influence in Europe, and the British victory at Gibraltar had emboldened London. There was a chance that when the British Parliament returned in November, they might oust Shelburne as Prime Minister and just continue the war. Parliament had already voted to increase the size of its navy for 1783. By contrast, France was really tired of war. The debts and hardships continued to pile up with little to show for it. Queen Marie Antoinette, who had never liked France's support for the American Rebellion, was at the point of trying to oust Vergennes over the ministry's refusal to back her brother, Emperor Joseph of Austria, to go to war with the Ottomans. Vergennes might have to retire in failure and disgrace. Now, not quite ready to sign a bad treaty, Vergennes considered one final gamble. He convinced Spain to assemble another armada. This very large naval fleet would carry a 25,000-man army to the West Indies. There, they would capture British-controlled Jamaica. After that, the fleet would sail up to New York and expel the British from New York City. And after that, the fleet would sail north to Canada and return that region to French control. The plan sounded almost naively optimistic. A proposed plan that required 3 high-risk victories seemed a bit ill-considered, but Vergennes was running out of good options. The commander who had pushed for this campaign was young, but also had had a good run of success. That commander was the Marquis de Lafayette. The young general returned to France following his role in the Yorktown victory. He arrived in France in January of 1782. The first thing he did was go home to his wife and sire his third child, daughter Marie Antoinette Virginie. After that, he began lobbying for a new military command. The king gave overall command of the Armada to the Comte d'Estaing. The admiral had recovered from his injuries, both to his body and reputation, for his loss at the Siege of Savannah back in 1779. Lafayette received appointment as chief of staff of this united French and Spanish force. He would lead a French army of 8,000 soldiers to march to Cadiz in southern Spain, where the fleet was going to depart. Once the fleet arrived in America, Lafayette would command the land forces that would be involved in the assaults on Jamaica, New York, and in Canada. Even while planning another military offensive, Vergennes was still looking for a respectable peace treaty with Britain. The story that British officials had told Jay about Vergennes secretly sending Gerard de Reneval to London to negotiate directly was true. Reneval had been working closely with Vergennes on negotiations. Because he spoke French, Spanish, and English, he served as translator at many of the early meetings with the American commissioners. The Frenchman had grown to distrust Jay as the American exhibited increased hostility toward the idea of working with France on a final treaty. Reneval had sided with Spain on the view that Spain should get control of the lands between the Mississippi River and the Appalachian Mountains. At one point during the debate, he noted that neither power really had a presence there, and if anyone had a claim to the land, it was the Indians who lived there. But everybody agreed that wasn't a realistic solution, and France and Spain were arguing that Spain should be granted the land. Vergennes personally seemed to share the view that Spain should get the land, but he kept quiet about it at these discussions. He allowed Reneval to make the point, so Vergennes personally would not be committed to anything. Reneval told Jay that he thought American land claims were extravagant, and this seemed to be the time that Jay decided that negotiating alongside France was not in the American interest. Now, it's not clear for certain the motivations, but one could certainly believe that Vergennes thought that sending Reneval to Britain might be better, since he seemed to be in such direct conflict with Jay. Using Reneval to feel out British terms of peace would have the benefit of getting those peace terms worked out, but it would also remove him from direct contact with the American commissioners. The substance of negotiations between Rainval and Shelburne are a mystery, since no written record of those discussions seems to exist. But Shelburne informed the king that Rainval seemed knowledgeable and down to business in getting the terms of the final peace treaty resolved. The king remained suspicious that anyone Vergennes sent did not have some level of cunning, and told Shelburne that he would not approve what he considered a bad peace. During the course of these negotiations, Britain broke the siege of Gibraltar. That victory not only increased the king's resolve, but British sentiment overall toward giving in to any kind of peace treaty that would not give Britain a big win. Shelburne could not agree to a treaty that appeared to give away everything if continuing the war would improve Britain's position. At the same time, if he did not have a treaty by the time Parliament reconvened in November, he might be thrown out of office in favor of a government that would continue the war. So by October of 1782, all parties seemed more than eager to reach final peace terms, but no one seemed to be willing to agree on exactly what those terms should be. Next week, the diplomats will finally be pushed into an agreement that we all know today as the Treaty of Paris. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, and Michael Mulhern. Thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Curtis Johnson and Chasen Harrison. Thanks also to Chris Rauch for a one-time gift through Venmo. I appreciate everyone who supports this podcast, either through continuing support on Patreon or through one-time gifts via PayPal or Venmo. This week we covered the ongoing peace negotiations in the summer and early fall of 1782. Franklin's illness puts most of the negotiation pressure on John Jay. Given that Franklin had serious concerns about negotiating without France, while Jay did not, meant that Franklin's illness probably had a big impact on the course of the negotiations. For France, everything that they hoped to do seemed to unravel with this. France had gotten into this war because they thought they could greatly weaken Britain at relatively little cost to themselves. Instead, after years of fighting, France found itself much more weakened financially and also militarily, despite a few successes here and there. At this point, France just wanted to get out of all this without taking too great of a loss. France had also convinced Spain to join the war, offering to help in getting back Gibraltar, which Spain very much wanted. According to some sources I've read, Spain would have stayed out of the war entirely if Britain had simply agreed to return Gibraltar in 1779. So France also had to convince Spain to end this fight without getting what it wanted. That was the real motivation between the final failed attempt to take Gibraltar in the fall of 1782. For France and Spain, that loss reinvigorated Britain and probably led to an even worse deal in the final treaty. We also see that this last gamble of an armada to attack the Americans, and if that actually happened, it could have made huge changes to the final peace. That said, I really think the leadership saw this as a long shot. Their last few encounters with the British Navy had gone pretty badly. The British Navy seemed more powerful than ever, while the French Navy, and the Spanish Navy for that matter, was failing, and they often didn't even have enough experienced sailors to service their fleet. We also see the arrival of John Adams in France for negotiations, which only seems to create more problems for everyone. I should also note that there is a fourth American commissioner, Henry Lawrence, who still has not arrived in France by October, and we'll get to that next week. I also wanted to mention that this week marks the 7th anniversary of this podcast. And as my tradition every July, I take this week to look at my podcast statistics. Downloads since the very beginning are now over 7.5 million, and that's 2 million more than last year. Over 92% of my listeners are in the U.S., rounding out that top 5 countries who listen to this podcast include Canada, the UK, Australia, and Ireland. The first non-English speaking country comes in at number 6, Germany, followed by Sweden and the Netherlands. I also like to look at which states have the most interest in this podcast. Now, of course, a lot of that is population. The largest states, California and New York, top these lists. But if I look at listeners as a percentage of the state population, Washington, D.C. always comes on top by far. But among actual states, the top 5 are Massachusetts, Vermont, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Virginia. And as seems to happen every year, the state of Hawaii comes in dead last. There have been quite a few changes to the show this year. I moved back to weekly episodes. I had been publishing bi-weekly for about a year, but thanks to your support, I was able to focus on this full time. It's been a little shaky at times, but I really do appreciate everyone who has helped chip in to allow me to continue this project. I also joined the Airwave Media Network this year, which for most of you, unfortunately means more commercials. The reality of me doing this full-time simply required that, though. I will remind everyone that if you support this show on Patreon, you can get access to commercial-free episodes with support as little as $2 a month. I'm also on the Into History Network, which gives commercial-free access to this and many other great history podcasts. Part of joining the network also required me to switch my host from Podbean to Megaphone, and I think that's gone reasonably smoothly. The other thing I want to address is where I think we're going from here. This week's episode covered the Treaty of Paris, which marks the end of the Revolutionary War. I've decided, however, that the end of the war will not mean the end of this podcast. Remember that we spent about a year's worth of episodes in this podcast before the war even began. There are still some pretty revolutionary things to come, including the Confederation era, which sees a few rebellions and other interesting events. If you think the history books give the Revolutionary War little coverage, some of these post-war events get even less. Yet they were really critical to the formation of the United States, and this podcast wants to take a look at them. I will start speeding through the years a little faster, but I hope to get to the formation of the Constitution, the new federal government, and the Bill of Rights. Where we stand right now in 1782 is about 7 years from the beginning of the war, but it's also 7 years away from when President Washington will be elected president. I hope that you will continue to find this interesting and continue the journey with me. My book recommendation this week is American Independence Through Prussian Eyes, a neutral view of the peace negotiations of 1782 to 1783 by Martin Luther Brown. As the title suggests, this book looks at the negotiations from the perspective of Frederick the Great and his government. It's a relatively short book, but gives an interesting perspective. It's older, first published in 1959, but there are used copies for sale, and you can also borrow the book on archive.org. So if this topic interests you, take a look at American Independence Through Prussian Eyes. My online recommendation is an even older book, simply called John Jay, by George Pellew. This is an 1890 biography that's in the public domain and available as a free download on archive.org. Jay plays a really critical role in the final negotiations of the treaty, and is not someone who is well remembered. He's an interesting guy who plays an interesting and important role in the Constitution, the courts, and future American treaties as well. So if you don't know much about him, this book might be a good place to start. John Jay by George Pellew. As always, I've included direct links to the book on my blog and website. My question this week asks, did George Washington really drive his officers bankrupt by making them purchase extravagant European-style uniforms with their own money? Well, I think Continental officers were more driven to financial hardship based on the fact that they were rarely paid, were paid with near-worthless paper money when they ever did get paid, and often got stiffed by Congress when they fronted their own money for military necessities of those under their command. I would not characterize their uniforms as extravagant. However, Washington was a big believer in looking good and spending money on clothes to achieve that look. Washington always spent money on top-quality clothing for himself, and that certainly included his uniforms. I suspect that many officers felt compelled to follow their leader's example. This idea, however, was not original to Washington. Pretty much all the Western powers knew that dressing well helped to identify one's place in society. The officers of all armies were expected to dress much better than the enlisted men they commanded, The traditions of the times were that officers would buy their own uniforms and that those would be of far better quality than those produced for enlisted soldiers. Officers equated with gentlemen, and gentlemen always dressed well. Despite this pressure, Washington knew and accepted that it was not always possible for the officers and men to have nice uniforms. In fact, sometimes they had none at all. I've told a story before about General von Steuben, who was known to hold sans-culottes parties at Valley Forge. Sans-culottes, of course, is French for without pants. He did this because his junior officers, who often did not have a good pair of pants to their name, could still attend the parties. Now, maybe it didn't hurt either that von Steuben was gay and enjoyed seeing young men without pants, but the stated purpose of the parties was clear to all at the time, since officers and men often wore uniforms that had been reduced to rags. Continental officers did what they could with what they had, and this varied based on their situation, but it was a hardship. Remember also that pre-industrial revolution, any clothing took up a much larger percentage of one's personal expenses than it does today. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on Twitter, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.